Welcome, everyone. I think that we are going to get started. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to Peace Week, organized by the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Each semester, Carter School Peace Week brings together faculty, students, and alumni, as well as friends and partners from across the peace and conflict resolution community for a week-long conversation around how to effectively address urgent issues of peace and justice. It is open to the public, and most sessions are held virtually to make them widely accessible. This week, we have dozens of sessions and have posted or will be posting a link to the registration page in the chat. So definitely encourage you to take a look and register for other sessions that pique your interest. We're catching you on the front end of it. So you've got 4 more days after this to jump in and see what all is of interest. So today, we have our session, Urban Peacebuilding, Possibilities and New Frontiers. It is co-hosted by the Program on Urban Peacebuilding and the Peace Engineering Lab at the Carter School. And we can put some links in the chat to direct you to those programs. Before we dive in, just a few more housekeeping items to share. First, please be sure, I think you all are muted, but mute yourselves as you come on board so that we don't have background noise. Second, we welcome you to please post your questions in the chat box throughout the session. We will have a Q&A session at the end. Also, if you have a question for a specific panelist, please be sure to include a reference so we can direct your question appropriately. Third, we are recording this session, so keep an eye out on the Carter School YouTube page if you'd like to rewatch or share over the coming days. And lastly, many thanks to Kayla Kuntz, who is a Peace Engineering Fellow with me at the Carter School, who will be providing background support throughout. So this year's theme of what works building peace at home and in the world in challenging times is almost custom made for our session today. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Professor Arthur Romano, to give us a brief introduction to what we'll be covering.
Welcome everyone to the Carter School, the virtual Carter School, and to our session on urban peace building. We're really excited. We've been planning this for a while and looking forward to bringing this dynamic group of scholars and practitioners together who we'll introduce shortly. I just wanted to give a quick kind of overview of the scope of what we'll be talking about today and a little bit about urban peace building. So over half the world's population lives in cities, and that figure is projected to increase to 68% of humanity will live in cities by 2050. At their best, cities offer social spaces that amplify the creative and cultural capital of residents, reinforce human dignity, and offer opportunities to thrive for people from all walks of life. And while cities can be places of connection, collaboration, and exchange, they can also be deeply divided along racial, economic, ethnic, religious, and other lines of social difference. And deep divisions and inequities in the city fuel destructive conflicts for millions of people living in cities globally that experience the far-reaching impacts of persistent violence. And the persistent violence exists in times of peace as well as in times of war. So liberal peace building, which in the peace building field has anchored a lot of our thinking about how we can engage, especially when there's been large scale conflicts internationally, has focused a lot on state-sponsored efforts and peace agreements and reconstruction of urban spaces after war. And while these efforts are important, we're here today because we think that we need additional efforts to build durable peace in urban areas. And cities provide a hub where local peace-building practitioners such as activists, artists, violence interrupters, environmental justice advocates network, innovate, and connect across lines of difference to engage in expanding circles of stakeholders that are doing peacemaking work. And there are many people working in cities to envision what a peaceful society looks like that don't carry a card or have an expert title. But work in their communities to make change, to sustain relationships, and to build community together. So today we thought it'd be a good idea to bring together both scholar practitioners and academics to discuss this growing area of study. We're not gonna, we were talking a little bit before this, and I said we're not gonna tie this area up into a bow and have 5 or 6 kind of key steps that have to be taken. But what we will do is outline the incredible diversity, right, of ways that people are thinking about what needs to be done in building peace and dealing with inequity in the city. And we'll consider how infrastructure, public goods, peace education, and shared democratic governance can help shape urban peace building and violence prevention. So with that, I would like to pass the microphone back to Ashton so she can introduce those who've joined us today, our presenters.
Thank you so much. Let me try to share my screen once more. All right, so I'm thrilled to be joined by quite a tremendous lineup today. All of our speakers have a wealth of experience, deep expertise, and wear many hats. I'll just offer a one-liner and invite them to provide any other context that would be helpful once we get into the discussion. So to start, we have Dr. Jason Willis, who is a program director for the University of the District of Columbia, UDC, Violence Prevention and Community Wellness Initiative, where he is leading the overall curriculum design for a 4-week hybrid gun violence prevention certification program. And we'll be posting some links and info in the chat, so keep your eyes posted if any of these panelists really speak to you. We are also joined by Dr. Rashmi Sadana. She's an associate professor of anthropology in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at George Mason University, and most recently published her book, The Moving City: Scenes from the Delhi Metro and the Social Life of Infrastructure. We also are lucky to have with us Noelle Roger. She is a community organizer and co-founder of By Peaceful Means, a grassroots organization that offers peace education and employment opportunities for Baltimore City youth. And she's also a PhD candidate at the Carter School. We are thrilled to have with us from across many ponds, probably, Dr. Anna Jorstad, who is a professor of political science in the Department of Government at Uppsala University in Sweden. She has published widely on democracy, governance, and local peace building initiatives, including a book she co-edited, From War to Democracy: Dilemmas of Peace Building. And lastly, but not leastly, Dr. Arthur Romano is joining me as a co-facilitator throughout, but he is a leading scholar practitioner in the field in his own right. He is an associate professor at the Carter School, where he leads the program on urban peace building, and most recently published his book, Racial Justice and Nonviolence Education: Building the Beloved Community, One Block at a Time. All right, so I'm thrilled to dig in here to hear from our panelists. Let me stop sharing my screen so we can see everyone. So with that, what I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists to please give a 5-minute or so overview of your work and describe what opportunities and challenges related to peace in the city your work seeks to address. So why don't we go ahead and get started with Dr. Willis. I'll pass it to you for your introduction.
Peace and blessings, everyone. Certainly an amazing opportunity to be in your presence. Special thanks to Arthur and his team. Certainly George Mason University for this opportunity. I'm incredibly blessed to be flanked by some incredible minds. And so for all those folks joining me as experts in the field, it's a pleasure to flank you. We're really excited about the program that we have at UDC, the Violence Prevention and Community Wellness Initiative. We thought really hard about what's the optimal way to construct the program so that it has flex, so it's empirically sound, so that it has the tentacles of being rigorous and academically anchored, while at the same time thinking about the methods and the bandwidth of the individuals that are going to go through our program. And so it's a very unique experience to have people that haven't graduated high school to be sitting at the college and creating pathways in that space. Not only kind of physically in terms of the structure, thanks to UDC, certainly Dr. Potter in the Office of the Chief Academic Officer. You have to have visionary leaders that see it and that get it, but also that create the constructs, the avenues, the bandwidth for something like this certification to materialize. As the only violence prevention and certification at a HBCU in the country, we couldn't be prouder of how the program has really nestled itself within the matrix of all of the folks that provide services within the DC area. It's really important for us to do it in a holistic way. And the way that we go about that is week one is an intense focus on trauma-informed care, both internal and external. The ability for individuals that go through our program that provide services in urban communities, for them to be able to be calibrated in a way that allows for them to recognize that they themselves have trauma, for them to be calibrated in a way to present in the capacity that allows for them to be more genuine with the individuals that they come in contact with. Violence prevention in community violence aspect, relationships are paramount. And so having those relationships and being able to build those bridges is really what we work on. There is a best practice for how ultimately those that are vested in violence prevention, kind of youth-based services, and then intervention work, what are those best practices? Sorry, we got a brand new puppy in the house, so hopefully he finds his legitimacy in a moment. Week 3 is really an important week for us because we focus on law enforcement. It's really important for everybody to recognize that law enforcement is completely vested in violence prevention and intervention work. And it's important for communities to be proactive in spaces where they're reactive. And lastly, we focus on youth-based and education-based services, recognizing that dropouts contribute in a significant capacity to the overall crimes in the United States. And how do we truncate services? To your point, Ms. Ashton, opportunities and challenges, clearly the challenges are there, right? For specifically African-Americans, males in marginalized communities, but oftentimes many of the people in marginalized communities. Statistical categories kind of bear that out. And the way to do it is really catch it further upstream. Is to provide services in places and spaces. We have the science of the brain of children. We try to leverage that in our program and those types of understandings to really know and target and be acute with the way that we push in services to youth. So that's really the gamut. I think the only other thing that I want to highlight now is, not only do we give you a core saturation of evidence-based work, but we also allow for like the next generation stuff. So we work within virtual reality and allow our participants to be the content creators of their own environments and their own space. And so they utilize this to be able to tell a story, one that's kind of earmarked with their tags and their voices. And these are really gap assessments and needs assessments if we're talking about instrumentation, rationales for how resources flow. So we're trying to be creative with unlocking kind of the back end aspect and possibilities on the new frontier, while also ensuring that they see everybody else that's doing the work and are able to provide, the appropriate scaffolds to the next pass off. We want folks in agencies to prioritize the people that we work with and the clients that they work with in the same way that we would prioritize them. So that's really the overall goal. We do so in person and online. 1 day a week is an experiential learning project-based, something that's meant for them to do in the field or within the context of their work or lived experience. So we try to break it up again to fit the modalities that people learn in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Willis. As a DC resident, I'm grateful that someone's taking such a holistic approach to these really important issues. I think what we'll do is we'll mix up the order a little bit here. Dr. Yarstad, would you like to go next and give us a 5-minute spiel?
Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to this important event and with so many interesting speakers. I really look forward to hearing what others have to say. I can say that I came into urban peace building studies via the local turn in peace studies, really. So in many other fields, there's been like in development work, of course, there's been always a focus on the local and the local actors. But for a long time in peace research, there was a focus on the international level and also the national level. And sometimes when you talk about like local ownership, for instance, you only really mean national ownership. So you talk about the the counterparts, the head of the states, and you call that local. But I'm more interested in the really micro level, but that is something that I've turned into, I mean, the last couple of years. So and so I've done work on Kosovo, for instance, where we have done interviews in northern Mitrovica, which is dominated by Serb population, and the otherwise it's the majority is ethnic Albanians, but in northern Mitrovica the majority is of Serb origin. But it is really a very mixed city, Mitrovica, and people live mixed in neighborhoods. So you have Bosniaks, you have Roma, Serbs, Albanians, and they live together. And many of them have lived together for generations. So through war and violence, they have lived together as neighbors and managed somehow to build friendly, many of them have built friendly relationships with their neighbors, and they have managed to work together to get access to clean water or electricity and things like that. So that is, well, my main message from the work that I've done. I've also done work in South Africa, in informal settlements, and I've done work on Afghanistan, on local ownership issues, and I worked on Bosnia and Cyprus and other places. But the main message, what I take away from my own research is that there is perhaps surprisingly a large degree of peace in the midst of violent conflict. So a lot of people do build peaceful relationships, and they can be manifested in different ways. But I think that this is something that is really important to focus on. That, I mean, we usually focus on conflict, but because that is what gets a lot of media attention, and that is something that we worry about, of course. But there's very little research on peace and what is peace and how do local actors perceive peace and how do they build peace from the bottom up. So I think we should like open our eyes and also see the strands of peace that do exist even in the midst of violence. And I think that is necessary for us if we want to also design interventions to help build peace with external support, that we really have to look for these peaceful relationships that do exist. So that is, I think, is very hopeful that it's possible. I mean, I've been focusing also on contested land, where Kosovo is one, and informal settlements in South Africa is another example, where people have lived generations on contested land. And usually yeah, you hear a lot about the violence, but not so much about peace. So that is my main, the main thing I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. I love
Yeah.
that framing, because I feel like we so often get pulled into the conflict side of things and don't recognize that cities are ripe with opportunity for peace.
Yeah.
And I think we'll have some great questions to tee up for you. Are there any other closing thoughts you'd like to offer before we turn to our next panelist?
No, maybe I can say that I think the city is a particularly interesting space to investigate and do peace work on, both study it and also build peace, because usually so many people from all over the country meet in the cities. But I know that some researchers say that, oh, they study the city because it's a microcosm of the entire country. And I think I would like to challenge that, because sometimes in some cities that I've seen, there's a completely different dynamic within the city than if you compare to rural areas.
Absolutely,
you.
well said. Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you very
one
much.
last thing, I must show my book that is coming out in May. It's coming
Oh,
out.
wonderful.
It's an open access volume, and it's coming out in May, and it's open access. So, relational peace practices. It's an
Terrific. Thank
edited
you for
volume.
sharing that. Great. If there's a link for it, a pre-order, feel free to throw that in the chat. All right, we'll appreciate that framing. I think that'll set us up really nicely for the discussion that will unfold. All right, I'll turn it next to Nawal.
Great. Thank you, Ashton. I'm super excited to be here and to be in this rich learning environment with all the other panelists and participants. So my name is Nawal Rajeh. I run a small nonprofit in Baltimore City called By Peaceful Means. And our mission is to interrupt violence through peace education and youth employment. And so we have been operating in East Baltimore community centers for the last 16 years. And we work with from the bottom up, in the sense of we start with 5-year-olds. So our program is for 5 to 13-year-olds. And we do a summer peace camp with them every year. And we usually retain about 75% of our youth year after year. And then when our youth turn 14, we offer them the chance to be counselors, junior counselors.
Hi, Harvest. How are you?
And to be employed by the camp. So last summer we had our highest number. We had 15 high school and early college students that worked for the camp that had been former campers. And then we had our very first ever former camper who was a senior counselor. So that was very exciting for us. And we're hoping to pass on all of the leadership roles here in a couple years. And we've also, starting about 3 years ago, had our first legacies join the camp, meaning that their parents went through the camp and now the children are in the camp. And so, so we run this model of peace camps where we come together every summer and imagine what's possible. And we build this, beautiful world, I think, within the 4 walls of our community centers. And we learn about inner peace and also peace and justice around the world. So each week we focus on a different peace hero that the kids learn about through arts-based learning. And, people from all over the world that are working for change in their societies. And so, I think that's what I'll say for now. I'll answer your question briefly about opportunities and challenges. I think for us, the challenges they're so glaring, they're everywhere. The second we step outside, there's so much structural violence in Baltimore, and there's so much physical violence, so much inequality. And so, we really sort of try and take on this idea that there are a lot of strengths in our community, and there's a lot of beauty and creativity. And if we can come together and focus on those things and build those things, it'll be a ripple effect around us. And so, I've been really honored to be a part of that program and happy to share it with you all today. So thank you.
Thanks a ton for that overview. I am struck by the asset-based framing approach. I feel like that's something we could probably all benefit from in our work. All right, so next we will turn to Dr. Sadana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ashton and Arthur and the Carter School for this invitation. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to think about my research on the Delhi Metro, which I'll talk a little bit about right now, in the context of peace building. It's not a framework I usually think about. This was just a really a great, it's a really nice thing to be part of. So I'm an urban ethnographer, and what that really means is that I study the street and street level politics and street level hierarchies, and how I see them in the city of Delhi, where I've been doing ethnographic research off and on for the last 20 plus years. The streets of Delhi can be very rough and very violent. They can also be very tranquil even and peaceful. And I have come to see the city through its, what I call its transport hierarchies. And that's really how I came to study its new metro rail system. It's an underground and above ground metro system. It's the first metro or subway, the first multi-line subway on the South Asian subcontinent. So why would I study a metro? And what does that have to do with peace and conflict and violence and nonviolence? So imagine yourself on a Delhi street, if you can, and you're going to see people, a ton of people walking, a ton of people bicycling, not in different lanes. You're going to see buses, big heaving buses. You're going to see auto rickshaws. You're going to see cycle rickshaws, which are powered by human beings who are actually cycling and pulling along other people. You're going to see a lot of cars. Since the liberalization of the Indian economy, there are over 1,000 new cars on the roads each week. You're going to see probably the majority of what you see on the Delhi street are motorcycles. That is the symbol of sort of making it to the middle class, is that you have your own vehicle. Probably won't be a four-wheeler, but it will be a two-wheeler. And you'll see men and women, and often 2-3 people on a motorcycle. So I'm painting what I hope is a lively, full picture of the Delhi street to show you how I came to understand issues of everyday mobility as being related to issues of class and issues of gender. So the reason why I started to study the metro, I will show you my book, which came out of this, called The Moving City. So you can see some of the metro lines. When I started the project, there were 3. When I finished the project, there were 10. The Delhi Metro is now the 7th largest in the world. It's one of the most technologically advanced because it's so new. It's a transnational production, but most everything now is made in India. So this process of the metro really has been going on for the last 25 years. And I studied the last 10 years of it. To study such an infrastructure is really to study the relationship between the state and society. And so the metro is, of course, transport. It takes you all kinds of places in record time, but the metro is also a place. It's a set of public spaces all over the city. And so in that way, it's really transformed the urban landscape. And so my interest really has been to study the metro as an infrastructure, and secondly, as representative of different kinds of intersecting mobilities. So to just kind of move to the next sort of part of the question about challenges, the biggest challenges in India in terms of, or in Delhi in terms of transportation, one is pollution. Cars are very polluting, and so the metro on one hand is much less polluting, and it takes people, out of the cars and into the metro. But the problem is that I mentioned motorcycles being a marker of middle class. Cars are even more a marker of middle class. And so people want, like people in New York and DC and, so many cities around the world, people want to have their own private cars. And so one of the challenges is not only making a metro, but it's also changing people's mindsets. And, on one hand, the metro is a social leveler, right? So you'll have an IT worker sitting next to a laborer, and you're all in the same, there's no different classes of tickets, you're all in the same boat or same metro car. So on one hand, I think that does contribute to peace in the city in terms of people of different classes and castes, being together in this public space, and also being off the roads, which are, as I mentioned, a little bit more rough in terms of the experience, in terms of accidents, in terms of road rage, and all of that kind of thing, in terms of safety in general. But so the metro offers this space, but the challenge is to convince people that it's a space for them, right? And so that's true of wealthier people who don't want to leave their cars and the safety and comfort of the private car and the status of that, but also poorer people who may not think the metro is for them because it is so hyper modern. It is so, the lights are very bright, the cameras are there, there's security protocols to enter into the different stations, all of the stations you have to go through, similar to airport type security. So how is that off-putting? How is something that on one hand is meant to be a social leveler, but can also be a form of exclusion? And this, of course, is related to, different kinds of government infrastructure. How much does it really offer this feeling of belonging to people in the city? But I'll just wrap up by mentioning some of the opportunities. And one of those has to do with the politics of mobility, who gets to go where. And one thing that the Delhi Metro has really done is that it's benefited women and increased women's mobility. There's a ladies' coach, or what they call the ladies' coach, a women-only car on the metro. And at first people were against it. They were saying, oh, this is patriarchal to have the division of men and women. But having that one ladies' coach has proved to be really revolutionary in some ways, because many women and their families are more comfortable traveling on their own and in the metro because of that ladies' coach. So there are different ways to think about this in relation to peace, I think. And I think one idea I take away from thinking about the peace framework is also how, peace doesn't just start at even the street level, but I think it really starts in people's homes, in terms of people's attitudes, in terms of family expectations, in terms of the different kinds of mobilities that are allowed or enabled by different kinds of infrastructure, and the certain kinds of exclusions that still very much can exist in a mega city like Delhi. So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much. That gives us a really rich both imagery and also kind of perspective into the structural and individual kind of pieces of the peace and conflict dynamic that emerge when it turns to actual built environment, physical infrastructure. So thank you. I'd like to just remind folks to put questions in the chat if any come to mind, but in the meantime, what we can do is turn to the second question we've kind of prepped our panelists for. I'm curious to know, and we can kind of open this up rather than going around the room, but what does your work reveal? And some of you alluded to this already, so I imagine you have some answers ready to go here, but what does your work reveal about specific interventions or approaches that are best suited for peace building in this city? Anyone want to start us off?
Sure, I'll start. I'm thinking about this term about contested space, and I think our cities, yeah, I came into this work through community organizing, and there's so much contested space in the city, especially now with gentrification, displacement being a global phenomenon. And yeah, so it really makes me think about the ways that peace intervention specifically, I think in the city, are really ripe for long-term accompaniment and long-term intervention, right? So not the outsiders like swoop in and bring some program and then bounce in a few months or however it might be, but that yeah, people on the ground who know their community, build up this piece together, and yeah, and accompany it, for the long haul, because it's slow work. And so much of the city is fast, right? And we kind of get sucked into that urgency, I think. But one thing that I've really felt over our 16 years is being, especially working with young people, is you can look over their lives and see the changes and just the growth. And so I really think that the slow, like walking beside one another, being in community together, has been really integral to that part of our work. And that's with our volunteers, some who are on this call, which is so exciting. And that's also with like our teachers who come back every year. But just having this community where people know, people build an identity then, right, around being peacemakers and peace builders. And they have a community that they continue to go back to and to be a part of, that is reinforcing that identity. And so even when we're not together, we might get calls from the young people, texts, right? When things pop up in their lives, they're coming back to this space, and they're really rooted in that identity of, like, in this space, this is who I am, and this is what's here for me, and they live into that. And I think that is because it's been that slow that slow work of walking with one another.
I love that contrast of cities as very, rapid fire, dynamic places, and the slow practices that are really needed to be cultivated over time, and also activating that sense of identity. As an urban planner, by training myself, I wish more urban planners saw themselves as peace builders, and I think shifting that perspective would really ignite a whole different conversation. But I saw Dr. Willis come off of mute, which is always a really nice way to transition. Do you want to take it from here?
No, yeah, I really was just going to dovetail. I mean, really, in a community-based violence perspective, the only thing that really counters that is love, right? And if you're talking about prevention, then you're doing that in the space of young people. And how else do you show young people love other than to spend time with them, developing those relationships, right? So I think that that's a really core element to something that's vibrant and has sustainability, that has longitudinal kind of impacts, where we can do some of this back-end research for some of the work that's really important in other community-based violent perspectives is our hospital-based systems, because we know that an individual that comes in with a gunshot wound or stabbing or blunt force trauma is already of the highest risk. We know that the hospital has methods to provide a multiplicity of services in places and spaces where programs might only provide one concentrated service. We know that the healthcare professionals have methods of dealing not only with the physical wound, but also the trauma that's associated with it in some degree. So I think that, just being thoughtful about the science of the brain of children, recognizing that our young people are like right hemisphere learners, and we still have them in left hemisphere type of school settings that haven't changed in over 100 years. Remember, our society has changed 3 times went from an agrarian society to industrial revolution, and now to all of our Y2K babies. And although it's been a beautiful arc to kind of track, certainly our school system should be malleable to how things have changed systematically. And I don't know that we see that. So the young people is the pool that I would love to get in terms of prevention, new opportunities, but we also just have to ground ourselves to like our hospital-based systems, especially in the space of community violence.
Well said. I'll have to, I think next year we'll do a session on urban love. I like that framing as well. Dr. Yarstad?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Jason, for, focusing on the youth. I think so. I think that is really where most of our hope goes, to the youth. And I have seen that, for instance, in Cyprus, where the conflict has been completely frozen for decades and decades. But now you see youth initiatives where youth from both sides of the island, Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, they are really the only ones who are trying to change the situation, make contact, making friends. And so that's where you find the little piecework that is done on Cyprus right now, because the island has been divided since 1974, and the northern part is there are Turkish troops there, and for a long time it was impossible to travel from one side to the other. But we see some positive change among the youth. And I also want to say, I think it's also important to try to identify actors outside of the large and well-established civil society organizations and international NGOs, because when and I come back to Kosovo and Mitrovica, so we try to, because the most vocal and loud voices are the ones who are making violence, and also actually some peace workers are reinforcing those voices, because it's in their mandate to build peace. So they also have to talk about the conflict all the time, and to make sure that it's necessary for them to be there. And a lot of locals that work for these international organizations, they are also part of this discourse in a way, reinforcing the conflict, even though they say they're working for peace, but they keep repeating all these conflict issues that are at the elite level between the political elites in Serbia and the political elites in Kosovo. But what we did interviews with people who had no connections to any international organizations, and to any donors, to any established civil society organizations, but more talk to local, ordinary people. And for instance, university students who didn't have any problems of finding friends and doing things together with people of other ethnicities. And there the language of instruction is English. So that, of course, also helps to bridge the divide between those only speaking otherwise Serbian or Albanian language. So I think it's important also to really involve these truly grassroots people. And it's difficult, but I think a lot of things are happening there that we usually don't see.
I think that is such a nice kind of way to pull the thread across the fact that these are, and we often think of urban peace building, I think, as within a certain context, and they are very context dependent, but also a lot of these issues that we see are whether it's in DC, Baltimore, somewhere in your, like, they connect all of us through their different dynamics. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Sedana, anything you'd like to tag along?
Sure, I'll just tag on that, in the kind of research I was doing, unlike some of the other panelists, you know, I wasn't working at the neighborhood level. I was thinking about the city as a whole, and how neighborhoods connect to one another. And I really came to see how public space is, I mean, I think in democratic societies, we generally value public spaces, even though they're shrinking. But I really came to see how public space can be a site for not only the breaking down of anonymity, but also the connection between communities and this kind of shared love, to go back to the original idea of love, that gets produced around this object that is the metro. And so that was really interesting to see over the course of the 10 years that I was doing the research for this project, was how people started relating to the city differently. You know, and it's a significant, you know, there's 3 million people who ride the metro, almost 3 million who ride it every day in a city of about 20 million. So it's a pretty significant, you know, group of people. And public space, or a public space like the metro, also creates a new idea of a metro public. And they become a new constituency that can, you know, ask for things, that can demand things, that can organize, that can have claims on urban space and on the state. And so this was also very interesting too, because unlike, you know, communities based on religion or language or region, this was a community, in a sense, based on, you know, a common understanding of the city, on a common resource in the city. And so I thought this is kind of an interesting way to think about how public space could relate to the idea of peace building.
Well, I want to thank you all. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and across different kinds of axes and planes of thinking about the city and thinking about peace building there. So I just wanted to, before asking a question, kind of just reflect back some of those different axes, right, in a way. On the one hand, I hear that we can play an active, conscious role in doing peace building in the city. We can build programs around that. We can focus on young people. We can support people who are most directly impacted by violence, and recognize the traumatic experiences they've had, recognize their expertise in being change makers, and really trying to stand with and support people who've been impacted by violence, to be in that role of being a peacemaker. So we can build programs, we can intentionally think about this work, and we can intervene, right? On the other hand, I'm hearing that peace is happening without us, which I find a relief, right? It's happening without the program too. And it's happening in dynamic spaces sometimes where people have been really, you would never think it could happen, in a way, where there's been war and where there's been politicization of ethnic communities and racialized communities, and all kinds of efforts to get people to engage in violence. And somehow people have found at a local level a way to stitch together community, to work together. And they didn't sign up on the mailing list, and they didn't check out the Instagram about the program. They're doing it, right? So then there's that, right? That's there too. And then I think what Dr. Sadan was saying is really interesting and useful too, because it brings in this element of infrastructure, right? Deeply durable, you know, with millions of dollars spent on it, hard to change in the sense of like the physical infrastructure being really set. And yet that kind of infrastructure is profoundly impacting people's life. I think you said mobility hierarchies. safety for people, where people have access to work, and those forms of infrastructure, in this case, transportation infrastructure, also help us zoom out and see the city as a connected space. At the same time that we see it falling short as not doing that connective work because people, because of class or caste or other reasons, don't take advantage of that, right? So we've got people doing it in one area. We've got people putting a lot of good effort to support people in stepping up and honor people who are already doing the work. And then we've got the built spaces and the intense, right, infrastructure of cities, so durable, so difficult to change in some ways, and yet with real opportunities to organize and make it work for more people, work better for more people. So that will lead me to ask a question that is not, it's not a question that necessarily stitches together those pieces, but just kind of takes your own perspectives on this. So for people that are hearing this, who are from, listening in, who are out there, we have, I can see here about 50 people or a little bit over on the joining us, and I see people from all over the world, from as far away as Japan and Philippines. Thank you for joining us. And so what do you think, for people who are scholars or practitioners that are interested in understanding urban peace building from a more systematic perspective, what are some of the main axes of study that we might be thinking of, should be thinking about or paying attention to? And this could be like research that you're directly doing or practice you're directly doing, or it could be where your research stops actually, and where you think and you see, I do see that we need more systematic efforts in these areas. So what are some of the main axes of study that we should be paying attention to? Are there any specific questions or problems or opportunities that you think really need to be addressed as we think about what urban peace building is or what it can be? So what are some of the main axes of study that you think could be part of this kind of field of urban peace study, could be part of it? And then are there specific problems or opportunities that you think need to be addressed, where we really need people to step up and start to do some work? Yeah, Dr. Yarsad.
Well, thank you for that question. I think one thing that I also mentioned in the beginning was this between what is different about urban peace building compared to other types of peace building? If you compare it to rural peace building, for instance, I think it would be really interesting if one can do a large systematic study to try to tease out under what conditions are urban peace building different from rural peace building, and when are they like the same thing? It's just that you have much more interactions and both conflicts and peaceful relationships in a city. So when is it a microcosm of the country, and when is it unique? Because in a way, like if you think about African cities, for instance, where you have huge influx of people coming from various parts of the country and then living in informal settlements, then some of them bring their like old ethnic conflicts with them, and they continue and they play out then at the local level in these informal settlements. But at the same time, some people that come to the city are also they change. They don't have these strong traditional ties and ethnic networks, and they build new networks. Perhaps youth start to interact with each other because of their age, and they form like performance groups, dance groups or something like that, and break free from like the old traditional structures. And so I think, you can see both dynamics, that it's very similar to what is happening in other parts of the country, but you can also sometimes completely new hierarchies, structures, and relationships develop in the city. So I think that would be really interesting to understand more. When is urban peace building different from other types of peace building?
So where there's cases where it's something about the city, right? It's something about the unique context of the city that changes it, right? That creates new possibilities. And it can be also on the other side of it, where the specific kinds of conflict that people are dealing with are conflicts generated by, in part, at least the context of the city. Yeah, invitation for anybody else. Yeah, Dr. Willis.
Yeah, Arthur, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. Doc, to your point, you know, my original brain jumps to, does one have the ability to environmentally change their location, right? I think that makes the city really unique. You don't have the ability or the capacity to go anywhere else. And so that creates new forms of feeling confined, strain, things like that. I think for your original question, Arthur, you know, we do things here really uniquely, and we have like a trough of opportunity zones here in America. So if we're just kind of staying in the youth based bucket, we need to horizontally and vertically align our education systems. So third grade in DC needs to be the same curriculum as third grade in other places. And we need to be thoughtful about how we engage education if we're going to go about providing this service, not only a public service, but private in many cases, charter as well. I think that we also have an opportunity to do it more thoughtfully in terms of having instruments and measures by which the teachers that perform the best work with the students that need it the most. Oftentimes our teachers that have the highest abilities work with the students that are the most affluent, right? And so that would be a paradigm shift in terms of how we process what we already have, good teachers with what we already have, a population of needy students. I think our colleges and universities have a responsibility to partner with buddy, brother, sister, with our high schools and the programs that have measures of sustainability and high impact on the outcomes, probably similar to, you know, Miss Rajay's program there in the Baltimore, which we'll find a way to bring that alive as well. And then also utilizing data in a way that's extremely important. Like dropouts commit 75% of the crimes in the United States. So if we front load that further upstream and push in services and programs and so forth, we know that homicides in the DC area, 11% of them are from housing projects. If we front load capacities and programmings for students that are in those housing projects. And so we have a number of different things that we can leverage. Certainly we want to be evidence-based and make sure that we're not just trying to recreate the wheel, but that we're doing it in a way which signals that we love and that we're authentic, and that everybody's on board moving in the same direction.
Yeah, and when I'm hearing you talking about that, Dr. Willis, I hear too that an opportunity kind of slash challenge around having these pushing these existing institutions to change, you know, and the role of community, that kind of tension that's there sometimes where people are doing community-based work, in part because it's hard to do that work inside the institutions, to actually have the space to do the kinds of education like are happening at the camp, like are happening with the programs that you're generating. And so we have these existing institutions where many people go through them, right? They touch many more people's lives, the formal schooling does. And then we have dynamic programs on the outside of those institutions. And so it raises that's a systematic question, right? in terms of how do we change the system, those systems. And sometimes when people are doing work on the outside of those systems, they might not have a direct impact as much.
Or they might not, or
systems
they
themselves.
might feel like they don't see the direct impact, right? So like the refraction of the lens, even in youth-based, but with the adults as well, once you know better, it's kind of incumbent upon you to do better. And so there has to be like that motivation and transformational leaders, I'm sure, like yourself, that are just spurring folks along, but also, not just driving, right? Not just spurring, but also loving along the way. It's really important to relationship building. So yeah, I concur.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. Arthur, did you have something for that? Sorry.
Just an invitation to join.
Great. Yeah, I'm thinking about this question about, what is different in the city, the peace building in the city, what's the difference? And I can only speak to the US context, but, the thing that came to my mind is all of the decades and decades of disinvestment in our cities and in certain parts of our cities has led to, this pressure cooker of issues right now. And I think systematically, right, we have to look at all of that disinvestment. And then I love the idea of, public goods being part of that solution. So one of my passions is housing. So, decommodify housing as a human right, reimagining housing is going to touch every part of people's lives because people are being pushed out of their city. They don't have decent housing. That means they have poor health. They can't pay to get on the metro, right? The DC metro specifically, you're paying by distance. So it's impacting every part of someone's life. And so without us looking at those systems and thinking both about how these issues came out of, there's a deficit of political will to fix these issues in our cities from the state. And instead of looking at, the history of disinvestment, the city officials are looking at, oh, well, let's put a Band-Aid on it. Let's redevelop. Let's push people out. And I think we need to systematically look at what's underlying all of these issues, and then what are new ideas and new models for fixing these decades-long issues.
I can just add to that. One of the things one of the places that I spent a lot of time at on the metro were actually the ends of the lines. And so the ends of the lines were, in many cases, hinterlands of the city. In some cases, almost rural areas of the city. And so this really made me think about, well, what is the city as a form, and where does it end? And I think there are many kind of urban agglomerations, such as Delhi, or the Delhi National Capital Region, as it's called. But I think in terms of thinking about urban peace building, it's important to think, and I think Anna brought this point out as well, of who is coming into the city, the ideas coming into the city, the experiences, the aspirations, and really to think about maybe the urban as more of a mutating kind of form. And I know in the Indian context, it's really vital to think about the relationship or the continuum between the urban and the rural, because of those migrant flows, and because of the cultural flows, the migrant and cultural flows, in addition to economic and political ones. So perhaps a way forward, or one of the ways forward for peace building, is to think about that relationship, and also I would say the role of the state in mediating that relationship.
Thank you. I think in a minute here, Ashton's going to move us to some questions so those of you that are out there, if you're cooking up a question, we have some comments that are in the chat that are definitely worth checking out as well. And we'll move to that in just a second. I can't help but just wanting to pause for a second and mark some of the, so many great ideas that I think came out of that, in a way, of that discussion right there. So one, I hear with this last point here around, it's, the city's not set, right? It's dynamic, it's moving. I almost had you said mutating, Rosalynn, I almost had this idea too of like lungs in a way when you were describing it. It's like the city is filling up, people are coming in, they're leaving, there's a change that's happening. So that dynamism of the city is absolutely critical to understanding what's possible. That's an axis of study and practice for urban peace building. And then this component around thinking about the history of divestment and policy, right? And that this is not an accident, and what's happening, and people are durably experiencing forms of conflict over and over again. It's happening because of policy decisions and the dynamics of political will. So as great as it can be to invent programs and try new dynamic things, we have to look at the structural conditions that are reproducing the dynamics of the conflict. And two, piece I was hearing in what Jason was saying that is, echoes what we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of the systematic impacts and the energy of community change and community leaders, and that dynamic interplay between, I'm just going to say, the informal and formal systems, or community-based and institutions. That there's an interplay there that seems really important for thinking about what's possible in terms of the city, and then this studying what's working in terms of peaceful coexistence and the peace that already exists in the city. So that could keep people busy for a long time, right? And if we're thinking about what is urban peace building, right? What is urban peace building? And part of what is exciting, I think, about that is that you have a container in the city with a kind of critical mass of people, right? And they're spatially proximal to each other, right? So it's an opportunity to try to think more systematically and understand the dynamics on these various levels, to think about how we can increase the peace through these various levels of, working at various levels at the same time, and maybe also people just seeing themselves on the team, right? And you don't have to have Peace Builder on your card, and you don't have to formally claim this in any direct way to be contributing to that, contributing to making your community more peaceful, contributing to the city being a more equitable place, contributing to building the political will necessary to give people the kinds of opportunities they need in the city. So Ashton, do you?
Yeah,
There
haven't
any reflections
been,
or?
Yeah, there are some comments that came in. I'm not seeing any specific questions, so I might tee up a question that I've kind of been simmering on myself as y'all have been talking. One of the aspects of urban peace building and urban conflict that I'm particularly interested in is how a lot of these policy decisions get made. I think that there are community engagement processes that have been, on the one hand, striving to be very inclusive and get voices involved that have been disenfranchised over generations. And at the same time, we see that a very vocal minority can fundamentally change the direction of how some of these decisions, particularly about the built environment. So I think a lot about transportation networks and how someone can be very grumpy about putting in a dedicated bus lane, and that can change the trajectory of an entire network of connectivity. And so what I'm curious to hear about is thinking about this public-private kind of dynamic, thinking about how space is at a premium in cities and how that in and of itself generates opportunity for conflict and peace. You know, how you think community engagement processes, you know, either aligned with these kind of informal networks of folks, but from a more kind of bureaucratic community engagement standpoint, you know, how we can maybe think about those dynamics that play out and where opportunities for peace might be there.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That's a layered question. I know within municipalities, a lot of times there's red tape in terms of like securing grants or the process that the organization needs to go through in order to secure grants. So if we take something tertiary, not really invested in the word, but like MWB, Minority Women in Business, as a part of your organization to be able to legitimize yourself in the space of securing dollars, whether that's, you know, federal ARPA dollars or state-based, community-based grant dollars. It's going to be a small amount of people that actually have that access. And it's also going to be the potential for competition over resources and folks working in silos elevates a little bit more so. And so completely detached from what's going on in the community at the grassroots level, these things certainly impact how programs are able to legitimize themselves in the place of sustainability, legitimize themselves in the place of best practice, and having really positive outcome-based measures for communities to look back on. So I think, to your point, it's important to be aware, and it's important to find co-conspirators. I can't really emphasize it enough. You know, long gone are the days where we need allies, people to stand next to us and say, hey, I think that's a really cool thing you got going on over there at UDC, right? We need people to be a part of the UDC program. I want law enforcement. Yes, I want you to come talk, but more importantly, I want you to send your folks through the program so that we all have common knowledge, a general understanding. And I think that there's a way to do it with love at the center and through professional levels of savvy in order to effectively nudge in that direction. But I would say that that's actually the place where, for the work that I do, especially within municipalities, there's some hidden unanticipated consequences and challenges and hurdles that arise. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it reminds me too a little bit of what Dr. Sedona was saying in terms of, you know, folks are coming in from the peripheries and going into the middle of the city. You know, who gets to decide what happens in this city? You know, is it the people that live there? Is it the people that come in there? Is it the people that, you know, are you know, managing the grants? Is it, you know, there are so many levels of, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in America, it's where the dollars flow. I can't only speak
Yeah.
from the context of what's going on here. America is a corporation. It's well documented. And if you follow the money, you follow priorities of individuals that make and create the rules. So there is a reason and a rationale oftentimes why rules don't change. And we know about that across, you know, socioeconomic levels. So yes. And yes, that is the tripwire as well.
Tripwires, I haven't heard that phrase before, but that definitely feels right. Any other folks want to chime in on this before we kind of open it up to folks? I know I see some comments in the chat as well, but any things that folks want to reflect on? One person in the chat kind of pulled the thread further on this intergenerational aspect of peace building, bringing youth into the work, sharing perspectives of elders in the community. We haven't talked a whole lot about elders, and I feel like that's an interesting space as well, given that so many of urban neighborhoods are going through such rapid periods of change, and oftentimes it contrasts pretty starkly with more historical perspectives on what the community is and what the community means. I wonder if folks have any quick thoughts on Georgia's question there or comment there.
Yeah, I think George's comment and also the previous conversation just make me think again about how we need to orient ourselves and be okay with the slow work of building community and of bringing in different voices and perspectives. I think there are ways that, intergenerational spaces are made in communities. But I think oftentimes, again, there's like the urgency and the rush. And so it ends up being a little bit like, oh, the youth are like this, and, the elders are like this. And yeah, and I just really see peace building work sitting at the center of that to slow that down and create longer, more intentional relationships between people. So yeah, I'll just offer that.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, maybe I can say something about the intergenerational perspective. I mean, since I focus on countries where there's been a civil war, it's usually when it's time to build peace, it's usually the elite that had been involved in the fighting. They sign the peace agreement and set up the structures for the future peace. But actually, they don't know how to build peace. They just know how to fight. So often there's a need for a shift, of course. So then we can place a lot of hopes in the younger generation, but it's at the same time, there's also, I think the younger generations, that's where a lot of peace work is done, but it's also where other forms of violence erupts. I've been studying the violent protests in South Africa, for instance, the protests against poor service delivery, against to decolonize universities, a lot of violent protests, and that's of course also driven by the youth. So we shouldn't romanticize the youth but I think that they are like they're very key actors, because it's both easier for them to break with the old habits and their old networks, and break away from some of the youth then don't have any ties to the former fighting groups and the ex-combatants. So there's a potential there, but there are also, of course, a lot of frustrations in these post-war societies where the youth perhaps do not appreciate peace as much as the older generation, because what they see is that perhaps, like in South Africa, some say it was even better during apartheid. We had clean water, we had jobs. Now we have nothing. We are starving, and we have stayed in these. We have nowhere to go except for these informal settlements, and nothing is happening. No land reforms like the ANC promised 30 years ago. Still nothing has happened. So there's also a lot of frustration, of course, in the among young youth in post-war societies. It's the same in Bosnia too, where there's also a lot of nostalgia, where the old folks at least say that, oh, everything was better during Tito, and when there's a dictatorship, we had no freedom, but at least we were not starving like we are now. But I think that this is really very important. How to also bridge the gap, of course, across generations. But I don't think it's an easy. There's no easy response to this about the intergenerational, how that affects peace work, I think.
I love what you're saying about the youth and their importance. And oftentimes when we see powerful movements, we find out that it's powerful young people at the center. There's some best practice around what's culturally responsive pedagogy and practice. And part of that, in order to be able to develop relationships most appropriately, is you have to legitimize what young people already know. You have to legitimize the spaces that they're in. You have to legitimize their ability to problem solve and to create mechanisms of safety and to tether themselves to their own environmental features that keep them afloat. Then and only then can you begin to rework within their spirit some new possibilities in how to move people forward, especially young people who we know whose frontal lobe is still developing from, the science of the brain of children. Again, it's really, really important. And so a full layer of immersion, do you actually come from and spend time within the communities that you're serving, is one way to have a very acute sense of what's going on. And then do you also have the ability to understand all of those other tentacles of folks and organizations that are using those folks in marginalized communities in order to be able to substantiate their data. So I think that, our young people can see through all of that stuff. They're not so worried about the structural stuff. They're worried about the bonds that they have to their environment. And so we want to be the positive bond for young people so that they can see the promise and then allow them to do what they do naturally and support them in their brilliance because they're brilliant.
Yeah, and I think to just tag along onto that point, yet they're so often not included in those formal bureaucratic processes of how we should build our, cities and structure our communities or what have you. And so I think that offers a real challenge and prompt to policymakers and urban planners and other folks that are making really substantial, investments in our built environment around how do we ensure that the people who will be stuck with these decisions for generations to come are being involved in a way that really activates their agency and takes into account the inherent wisdom that they have about what it's like to be living in these spaces. So I appreciate that. We did have I think a kind of I see two people coming off mute. So maybe we have one question that I want to get to in the chat, but offer it up to Noel and Dr. Willis to offer any thoughts on that.
Just a quick comment that I am sitting here thinking about the ways that we define peace. And, my background is that my family came from civil war in Beirut, and the way that they would define peace is very different, right, than the way that the young people I work with would define peace. So I think justice especially is becoming more a part of that definition for young people. Like without justice, there isn't peace. So it's not just, but I hear this narrative from people like my parents that are like, oh, peace was when things were calm and controlled. And so I think just really integrating what people believe and feel about peace and making sure that we're asking people, what does peace mean to you?
I had kind of a similar comment as Naval, is that, peace for whom, I think that's a real issue. And, I know in the case of India, including Indian cities, we have an increasingly authoritarian national federal government. And, the idea of majoritarian politics and Hindu nationalism and Hindu supremacy has really taken over the last 8 years. So unfortunately, if you ask, a middle-class Hindu in the city what their idea of peace is, it's going to be very different than if you ask a lower middle-class Muslim person in the city, and of course, this takes us back to the issue of, the reverse of peace, of conflict. But when these things, at least in the Indian context, are really getting they're becoming part of the structures in ways that they weren't before. And so, yeah, I just want to throw that out there.
Absolutely, a really important perspective. So I alluded to one question in the chat, and I'll try my best to sum it up. We're actually surprisingly getting up to the end of our time together, and so I want to ensure we have just a couple of minutes to wrap up. So what I'll do is I'll share out the question that one of our attendees put in there, and maybe offer it up for one of you to offer your reflections, and then I'll turn it over to Arthur to bring us home. But Tiff offered that, there's generally some ways that rural communities are being encouraged to urbanize, or there's, this shift, as Dr. Sodano was talking about before, as urban areas grow, expanding into these spaces and talking about economic and social opportunities that are kind of being transformed in that way. And they're wondering in what ways urban peace building would be utilized not only to prevent cultural overthrows in rural communities, but strengthen ties of unity between the two spaces. So any thoughts on how to kind of shift what we've been very focused on the urban, obviously, but potentially draw some connections to what we might see in a rural space?
So I don't think that relationship building changes much from urban to rural, so long as there's a full layer of immersion. If I go to, 50 miles outside of town, I'm going to have to get a lay of the land. I'm going to have to know, how law enforcement moves in that space. I'm going to have to know what's the code of streets in that space. I'm going to have to know how to double dutch in and out of conversations. I'm going to have to know when to code switch and have a more Eurocentric presentation to my African American vernacular English. So all of those things are still going to be present. So I don't know how it works, again, from an international perspective. I always feel like unfortunately, with as many guns are here in America, almost 2 per citizen in a country of 400 million, we almost feel the residual impact of constantly being in a state of civil war, communities under intense layers of pressure and violence and trauma, post-traumatic slave syndrome as it relates. And so these things are really omnipresent, and they our young people can't always communicate what they feel, but they feel. And so, Doc, to your point earlier about, we need to make sure we don't placate our young people. To that point, and to your point earlier, Ms. Ashton, we certainly should be leaning in, incorporating their perspective, being thoughtful about ways in which we showcase to them what we think is love and a net plus in their life, and really just listen for the things that they need, and then be able to build their steps a little bit closer to those needs.
That's a really powerful words, Dr. Willis. Thank you for closing us out with those. And with that, I will pass it to Professor Romano to wrap us up.
Well, I want to thank our panelists and everyone who's joined us. You're leaving me with so many thoughts. So I hope this conversation will continue. I think in some ways, just with the statistics that we started with, 70% of humanity almost is going to live in cities, and the majority of human beings on planet Earth already do live in cities. And so to the extent that we have peaceful societies and just societies, that a lot of the creative energy for that is going to be birthed and realized in urban contexts. If I had more time, if we had another 30 minutes, I'd want to ask each of you what you think are kind of like the richest opportunities or the best examples you've seen of how urban spaces nurture visions of peace for our society, and help to kind of bring where you see pieces of the peace, right, in how people connect in cities. And I think that's a trajectory for research too, right? That for us seeing that cities are dynamic cultural spaces, are places which have led on the cultural edge of our societies, and in which we've kind of envisioned and experimented with how to be together. So I get a lot of inspiration from this conversation, and from the comments that folks made throughout the session, in thinking about how and what those potentials are, and how much already what we think of ourselves as human beings, what can be, and how we can organize and be together, has been expressed by bringing people together in cities, and where we have that kind of contact across lines of difference, and where we can see sometimes what's at stake, right when we walk out the door, and because we're connected to each other, we're in close proximity to each other. So thank you all of you, for your work that you do, for taking the time, an hour and a half on a Monday, when you have, I know, a long list of things that you're already doing. Thank you to everybody who joined us. We greatly appreciate you being here, and we're planning on launching a podcast on urban peace building. So hopefully you'll get to hear from some of these folks on the podcast at a later date. I'm putting them on the spot, but we're going to try to get that together this summer. And we hope that everybody who's who was able to join us in person, or who watches this later, will stay in touch with us as we continue to do events and do work around urban peace building. So thank you all. Appreciate it. It was a pleasure being together, and yeah, we'll talk to you soon.